Something unusual was found on a quiet American beach, but no one expected what was hidden beneath the sand. Watch until the end. What happens will surprise you. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a like to see more mysterious stories. The wind came in from the Atlantic before sunrise, sharp and salty, bending the dry reeds along the dunes of St. Clark Bay. The sea had never been kind to the people who lived there, but it had always been honest, and that was enough for Edward Miller. He had spent 52 years on this stretch of coast, fishing, fixing nets, and drinking coffee from the same chipped thermos every morning. His small wooden boat, the Lorna Jane, named after his late wife, rocked gently in the gray water, tethered to a weathered post that creaked like an old joint. Edward's life had been shrinking for years. The house he shared with Lorna stood empty now, except for the ticking clock and the smell of salt. His son, Michael, had left for Seattle long ago, chasing work and noise and forgetting to call. Edward didn't blame him. The bay had nothing left for young men, only silence, cold mornings, and memories. That morning began like any other. Edward rose before dawn, pulled on his wool sweater, and walked the path to the dock. The storm from the previous night had scattered seaweed and driftwood all over the sand. As he pushed the Lorna Jane into the tide, the fog lay thick over the water like a blanket. He navigated slowly toward the northern curve of the bay, where he sometimes caught cod hiding beneath the rocks. The rhythm of the waves, the hum of the motor, the creak of the boat. These were sounds he trusted, sounds that made the world feel stable. But as the light began to climb above the horizon, something unusual caught his eye near the shoreline. There, where the cliff descended into a narrow cove, the rocks looked different. At first, he thought it was just debris from the storm, maybe fallen stones or a broken jetty. But even from the water, he noticed the oddity. The rocks were arranged too neatly, forming a rough circle, deliberate, unnatural. Edward slowed the boat and stared for a while. No one ever came to that part of the beach. It was too remote and too hard to reach on foot. His pulse quickened with a strange curiosity that he hadn't felt in years. When the tide began to fall, he decided to check it out. He anchored his boat close to the shore and waded through the cold surf, his boots sinking into the wet sand. The closer he got, the more certain he became that the formation wasn't natural. The stones had been placed there purposefully, perhaps to hide something or mark something. He knelt, brushing away sand with his calloused hands, and uncovered a faint glint of metal beneath the surface. The morning sun hit it just right, and for a moment it flashed like a signal. Edward's heart beat harder. He pulled a small fishing gaff from his belt, the one he used for pulling nets, and used it to scrape around the shiny spot. More sand fell away, revealing what looked like the edge of a flat metal plate. He worked slowly, cautious not to damage it, until he could see a hinge at one side. It was a hatch, old, weathered, and nearly invisible beneath its camouflage of sand and stone. The metal was cold to the touch, slick with moisture. Whoever had hidden it had done so carefully. He hesitated, standing over it with the sound of waves breaking behind him. A chill crept up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something wrong about this, something secret that the ocean itself seemed to have tried to keep buried. Yet curiosity outweighed fear. He wedged the gaff into the crack and leaned his full weight on it. The hinge resisted, groaning under the strain, and then finally gave with a metallic shriek that echoed against the rocks. The hatch lifted slightly, releasing a gust of stale, cold air that smelled of rust and earth. For a long moment, Edward simply stood there, staring at the dark opening beneath him. The silence that followed the creak of the hinge was heavy, absolute. He took out his small flashlight from his jacket pocket. He always carried one out of habit and shined it into the void. The beam disappeared into blackness, but he could make out a ladder leading down, the rungs coated in dust and corrosion. He crouched closer, squinting. The walls below seemed to be lined with concrete, not rock. This wasn't some natural cave. It was man-made. Edward swallowed hard. His mind raced through possibilities. An old storm shelter? Maybe a forgotten storage bunker from the war. His father used to talk about those secret lookouts built along the coast to watch for submarines. But even those were supposed to have been sealed decades ago. Why would one be hidden like this? And why had no one mentioned it in all his years living here? He sat back on his heels and looked toward the ocean. The waves rolled in slow and heavy, each one dying on the shore with a sigh. He felt a strange weight in his chest, a sense that he had stumbled upon something meant to stay lost. The logical thing would be to close the hatch and forget about it, walk back to the boat, go home. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. The curiosity that had kept him alive through lonely years was burning now, whispering that answers waited in the dark. Still, he wasn't reckless. He reached for his phone, but realized there was no signal this far down the coast. He would have to climb the bluff or return to town if he wanted to call anyone. The thought of leaving the hatch open, exposed, made him uneasy. What if someone or something came out? He laughed at himself for the thought, shaking his head. Old fool, he thought. You've been alone too long. Yet, even as he turned toward the boat, his eyes drifted back to the gaping hole in the ground. The darkness there seemed alive, almost breathing with the rhythm of the tide. He felt the sea breeze on his face and caught the faintest trace of something else in the air. A metallic tang mixed with a smell that didn't belong to the ocean at all. Oil maybe, or earth disturbed after too long. Edward exhaled, stepped closer once more, and leaned over the opening. He pointed the flashlight deeper this time. For a second, the beam flickered against something, walls lined with boxes or maybe crates stacked along the far side. The light caught on a bit of plastic or fabric, something pale. He couldn't make it out clearly, but the sight made his stomach twist. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just forgotten tools or fishing gear. He shut off the light and stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the surf suddenly felt louder, the air colder. He knew then that he shouldn't be here. He should call the police or at least tell someone from the harbor authority. But a strange instinct warned him not to linger, as if the very beach wanted him gone. As he made his way back toward his boat, the fog began to drift inland again, swallowing the shoreline. He looked over his shoulder one last time. The hatch, half covered in shadow, almost seemed to vanish back into the earth. Edward climbed aboard the Lorna Jane, started the motor, and turned toward home. The gulls followed him for a while, circling overhead, their cries sharp and hollow. Behind him, the strange circle of stones stood silent, guarding its secret beneath the sand. Edward didn't know it yet, but that discovery, the one he had made in the pale dawn light, would unravel everything he thought he knew about his quiet little town and the sea that had raised him. Edward didn't sleep that night. The storm had calmed, but his mind would not. He sat by the window, watching the moonlight shift over the waves, the hatch's image repeating in his thoughts like a haunting photograph. What was buried beneath that beach? The question wouldn't leave him. By morning, his decision was made. He would return and find out what lay below before he involved anyone else. He told himself it was just curiosity, but deep down, it felt like something more. A pull. The same kind of pull the sea had always had on him. At dawn, he packed a thermos of coffee, a rope, his flashlight, and a small crowbar. Then walked the narrow path back to the cove. The tide was low, the sand still damp, and the gulls were quiet. The hatch looked exactly as he had left it, half buried in the sand, cold and uninviting. For a moment, he stood still, hoping maybe the sea had swallowed it back, but it hadn't. It waited. He placed the rope around a sturdy rock and looped it through the ladder, testing it for strength. The air that drifted up from below was stale and heavy, as though it hadn't moved in decades. When he pointed his flashlight down again, the beam stretched maybe 15 feet before hitting the floor of what looked like a small concrete room. Edward took a deep breath and began to descend, the metal rungs creaking under his boots. Each sound echoed up the shaft, the kind of hollow sound that made him think of cathedrals or tombs. When his feet touched the ground, the flashlight revealed a narrow passageway. The walls were lined with rusting pipes and cables, the ceiling low enough that he had to stoop slightly. Dust floated in the beam, stirred by the movement of air from above. He whispered to himself, half to keep his nerves steady, half to remind himself that he was still real in this silent place. He moved slowly through the corridor, following the faint sound of dripping water. The further he went, the more he noticed signs of deliberate construction: cement floors, reinforced corners, electrical wiring that had once powered something. It wasn't a natural cave. It was built, planned. After maybe 30 steps, he reached a door made of thick metal. It stood slightly ajar, its hinges streaked with rust. He hesitated again, his hand trembling slightly before he pushed it open. The room beyond made him stop cold. His flashlight circle landed on a stack of packages wrapped in plastic, piled neatly from floor to ceiling. Each one bore a dark, oily stain that glistened faintly under the light. He moved closer, reached out, and tore a small corner of one open. A sharp herbal scent filled the air. He didn't need experience to know what it was. Drugs, marijuana, most likely, stored in enormous quantities. His heart pounded, and his first instinct was to climb back out immediately. But then his eyes adjusted, and he saw more. Equipment, ventilation shafts, a generator that looked newer than the rest of the place. Someone had used this bunker recently. There were footprints in the dust, faint but visible, leading deeper into the corridor beyond. A chill spread across his shoulders as he realized he wasn't just looking at something old. This was part of something alive, something ongoing. He swallowed hard and turned back toward the ladder, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He'd gone too far already. He needed to get out and call the authorities before whoever owned this place came back. As he reached the base of the ladder, the air shifted. Somewhere in the darkness behind him came a faint sound. Metal against stone, soft but unmistakable. He froze, listening. Nothing followed, but the silence after was worse. He climbed quickly, each rung groaning beneath his weight, the beam of light bouncing wildly around the shaft. When he reached the top, he shoved the hatch open and pulled himself out, gasping for air as sunlight hit his face. He closed the hatch with trembling hands and piled sand over it again until only the faint outline remained. His pulse was still racing as he stumbled toward his boat. On the way back to town, Edward tried to steady his breathing. The coastline looked ordinary again, calm and clean, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The knowledge of what lay beneath that sand felt like a weight pressing against his chest. He knew he couldn't keep it secret. When he reached the dock, he tied up the Lorna Jane and walked straight to the police station, a squat brick building near the harbor. Inside, behind a cluttered desk, sat Sheriff Thomas Reed, a man in his 30s, with steady gray eyes and a calm voice that had earned the town's trust. Edward told him everything, about the stones, the hatch, the ladder, the bunker, the packages. The sheriff listened without interruption, then leaned back and exhaled. He asked Edward to take him there. Within the hour, they were driving along the coastal road in the sheriff's truck with Deputy Linda Harris following behind. The beach looked even lonelier now, stripped of all illusion. Edward led them to the spot where the hatch lay buried. They cleared the sand away, opened it, and descended together. When their flashlights cut through the darkness, the truth revealed itself fully. Hundreds of sealed packages lined the walls like bricks, a silent monument to greed. Reed's expression hardened. He called for backup immediately, his voice steady but low. Edward stood there, his hands trembling, feeling smaller than he ever had before. He had opened a door to something vast and ugly, something that didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of St. Clark Bay. When they climbed back up, the afternoon sun had turned the sky a pale gold. The sheriff placed a hand on Edward's shoulder and told him he had done the right thing, that without him, they might never have found it. But as Edward looked back toward the cove, a strange unease stirred inside him. The beach was still, yet he felt as if unseen eyes watched from the cliffs. Something told him this wasn't over, that what he had found was only the surface of something deeper. As the police cars arrived and men in uniforms began to move across the sand, Edward stepped aside, the waves murmuring at his feet. He watched the sea stretch endlessly before him, calm and unknowable, hiding its secrets as it always had. He didn't know what was coming next, but one truth settled quietly in his heart. Once you uncover what lies beneath the surface, you can never go back to who you were before. The investigation began before sunrise the next day. Floodlights lined the cove, casting long white streaks across the sand, while officers moved in silence, their boots leaving deep prints that the tide would erase by morning. Edward stood beside Sheriff Reed, watching as men in protective gloves and masks carried box after box up from the hatch. The smell of salt mixed with the pungent odor of the drugs that had been sealed away for years. Every crate they opened revealed the same thing: tightly packed bundles of marijuana wrapped in plastic, each marked with coded symbols that no one could decipher. Edward had seen enough to understand. It was not the work of small-time dealers. This was organized, deliberate, and dangerous. Reed spoke quietly into his radio, coordinating with a team that had begun inspecting the nearby cliffs. They had discovered that the bunker stretched further inland than anyone expected. A narrow tunnel branched off from the main chamber and seemed to lead toward an abandoned property a half-mile away. When the first agents from the State Narcotics Unit arrived, Edward was asked to recount his discovery once more. He repeated every detail carefully, his voice steady, but his hands restless in his coat pockets. The officers listened, then assured him he had nothing to worry about, that they would handle the rest. But Edward could see the weight in their eyes, the awareness that this was bigger than they wanted to admit. He lingered at the edge of the investigation, feeling both a part of it and far removed, as if watching a movie filmed in his own backyard. By mid-afternoon, they unearthed a second chamber, a larger one, lit by dusty bulbs that flickered weakly when power was restored. It contained a small generator, empty fuel cans, and a desk covered in yellowed papers. There were notes written in block letters, inventory sheets, and rough maps connecting the coastline to inland roads. The realization came slowly, but unmistakably. The bunker had been part of a fully operational smuggling route. Reed examined the papers and turned to Edward. The sheriff's tone was grim. The documents referenced the old Collins property, a house that had been left to rot after its owner vanished 3 years earlier. According to the files, a tunnel connected that property directly to the bunker. The smugglers had been moving shipments from the house to the beach, using the tides to cover their tracks. The operation had likely been running for years, hidden beneath the routines of ordinary life. The sheriff called for a full perimeter search. Edward followed at a distance, drawn by equal parts fear and curiosity, as the team moved toward the crumbling structure that stood half-hidden behind wild grass and pine. Inside the abandoned house, dust lay thick on every surface. The air smelled of mold and salt. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper that peeled away in strips, revealing the gray boards beneath. At the back of the kitchen, beneath a loose plank, they found the entrance to the tunnel. It was reinforced with concrete and old timber, wide enough for a person to carry large crates through. One of the officers remarked that it looked like something from a war film. Reed knelt beside the opening, shining his flashlight down the passage. The air that rose from below carried the same stale scent as the bunker. There was no doubt. Now they were connected. Edward watched as they descended, the beams of their lights cutting through the darkness until they disappeared completely. When they returned, they confirmed it. The two spaces were one system, stretching from the cliffs to the sea. As dusk approached, reporters began to arrive. News of the discovery had spread faster than Reed could contain it. Cameras flashed, and microphones pointed toward anyone willing to speak. Edward tried to avoid them, but one journalist recognized him from the harbor. She called him the fisherman who found the hatch. And suddenly, everyone wanted his story. He spoke briefly, quietly, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want fame. He only wanted the beach to feel safe again. Behind him, officers continued their work, counting, photographing, and sealing evidence. By nightfall, the estimate of the seized drugs had reached over $3 million in street value. The agent spoke of arrests to come, of leads already forming, but to Edward, it all sounded distant, abstract, like numbers on paper that didn't capture the unease curling in his chest. After the last camera crew left, the cove fell silent again. The lights remained, their harsh glow turning the beach into something foreign. Reed approached Edward one final time before heading back to town. He thanked him, promised to keep him informed, and told him that without his discovery, the operation might have continued for years. Edward nodded, but the sheriff's gratitude felt hollow. As the police cars pulled away, the old fisherman remained on the sand, staring at the dark outline of the waves. The sound of the sea had changed somehow. It no longer whispered peace. It carried an edge, a reminder that beneath its calm surface lay secrets no one should ever uncover. He walked home under the dim light of the moon, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. The town would talk for weeks about the St. Clark Bay bust, about the hero fisherman who had stumbled upon a fortune in drugs. But Edward knew better. There was nothing heroic about it. He had simply followed his instincts, and in doing so had torn open a wound that had been festering beneath the town's surface. When he reached his house, he stood for a long time on the porch, listening to the wind move through the reeds. The horizon glowed faintly in the distance where the searchlights still shone on the beach. He thought of Lorna then, how she used to tell him that the sea always gave back what it took. Sometimes shells, sometimes wreckage, sometimes the truth. As he closed the door behind him, Edward realized that the truth the sea had given him was far heavier than he was ready to bear. The town changed overnight. What had been a quiet fishing community became a place filled with flashing lights, patrol cars, and strangers with cameras. Reporters flooded St. Clark Bay, setting up along the dock where Edward used to unload his catch. Headlines called him the fisherman who uncovered the hidden drug empire. But none of it felt real to him. The sea still moved in its calm rhythm, indifferent to human noise. But Edward could no longer find peace in its sound. Every morning he woke with the same unease, a sense that something dark still lingered beneath the surface. The sheriff had promised protection, but rumors spread fast in a small town. People whispered that the operation had been too big to exist without help, that someone local had been involved. Edward noticed unfamiliar faces at the harbor and cars parked too long on empty streets. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched became impossible to shake. One night, the phone rang after midnight. The voice on the other end was low, distorted by static, but the words were clear enough. "You should have left it buried, old man." The line went dead before Edward could respond. He sat in silence, the receiver trembling in his hand. The house felt colder than usual, every creak of the floorboards louder than before. The next morning, he found deep scratches along the side of his boat. The name Lorna Jane carved halfway through by a knife. He went straight to Sheriff Reed, who took his statement, but admitted his hands were tied. There were no witnesses, no clear suspects. Reed looked tired, more than he had during the investigation itself. He told Edward quietly that some of the evidence from the bunker pointed toward connections beyond their jurisdiction, names that belonged to people with power, people who didn't like being exposed. That night, for the first time in years, Edward locked his doors and loaded the old rifle his father had left him. Days turned into weeks. The investigation stretched on, and while the public's attention began to fade, Edward's anxiety did not. He stopped going out to sea. The thought of the open water, once his only peace, now made him uneasy. Each time he glanced toward the cove, he imagined shadows moving near the rocks, reminders that some secrets never stay buried. One afternoon, as he was fixing a loose shutter on his porch, a black truck drove slowly down his road. The windows were tinted. It paused at the end of his driveway before turning around. Edward stood motionless until it disappeared beyond the trees. When he called Reed again, the sheriff told him to stay calm, to trust that they were closing in on the people responsible. But even Reed sounded uncertain. The tone in his voice suggested something larger, something dangerous. Edward knew what fear looked like, and he could hear it now in the man's words. That night, the wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of rain. Edward sat by the window, the rifle across his knees, watching the dark horizon. The sea roared louder than usual, crashing against the cliffs like a warning. He thought of Lorna again, how she used to calm him during storms, how her voice softened even the worst nights. "The sea takes what it wants," she used to say, "but it always leaves something behind." He didn't understand what she meant then, but now he did. The discovery had taken his peace, his anonymity, his simple life. In return, it had given him truth, and with it, a burden that no one else in the town seemed to carry. Just before dawn, he heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, moving across the gravel. He rose quietly, heart pounding, and opened the door. The yard was empty. Only the sound of the waves answered him, distant and steady. He stood there until the sun rose over the water, the light gray and thin like morning fog. When he went down to the harbor later that day, the mood among the fishermen was strange. Conversation stopped when he approached. Some nodded politely, others looked away. The news had spread that he'd been threatened, that his boat had been vandalized. People respected him, but they also feared being associated with him now. Trouble had come to St. Clark Bay, and no one wanted to be too close to it. As he walked back home, he noticed the same black truck parked near the old general store, its engine idling for a few seconds before driving off. That evening, Reed showed up unannounced. His expression was grim. He told Edward that they had arrested several suspects connected to the smuggling ring, but the man believed to be its leader had escaped custody during transport. His name was Victor Collins, the same Collins who once owned the abandoned house above the tunnel. Reed admitted that Collins had powerful friends and that it might take time to find him. He promised extra patrols near Edward's home and told him to be careful. For the first time since the discovery, Edward felt truly afraid. It wasn't just for himself, but for the town. He knew men like Collins didn't forget easily. They built their lives on silence, on secrets buried under layers of sand. When those secrets were unearthed, they always came back for what was lost. That night, the storm returned in full force. Lightning flashed over the bay, illuminating the cliffs and the restless water below. Edward stood at the window, watching the storm's fury, and realized how small he truly was against the elements and against the world of men who thrived in its shadows. Yet, even as fear gnawed at him, there was a strange calm in knowing he had done the right thing. He had pulled the truth from the depths, and though it had cost him peace, it had also given the town a chance to cleanse itself. Still, as thunder rolled through the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sea had one more secret to reveal, and that when it did, it would demand one final price. Months passed, and the sea slowly took back the quiet that had once belonged to St. Clark Bay. The reporters left, the police lights faded, and the town returned to its ordinary rhythm, though something invisible had changed. People spoke softer now, their laughter less frequent, as if the discovery beneath the sand had drained color from the air. Edward's name was still mentioned in hushed tones, not with awe anymore, but with a mixture of gratitude and unease. He had brought light to something dark, but light always leaves shadows. The authorities had sealed the hatch with thick concrete, covering it with rocks and fencing it off with warning signs. Yet Edward still avoided that stretch of beach. He told himself it was out of respect, but deep down it was fear. Some places, once opened, never close again in the mind. The investigation had ended with more arrests. Victor Collins had been captured 2 states away, found hiding in a warehouse near the border. The sheriff told Edward the news in person, his expression both relieved and exhausted. Reed had lost weight. The case had taken its toll on him, too. "It's over," he said. But Edward only nodded. He didn't believe things like that truly ended. Evil left traces, invisible ones that lingered in the salt and the soil. Still, the town began to heal. The police truck stopped patrolling his road, and for the first time in months, Edward slept through the night without clutching the old rifle beside his bed. When spring arrived, his son Michael came to visit. The reunion was awkward at first. Too many years had passed, too many things left unsaid. Michael had followed the news from afar, proud and worried all at once. Seeing his father older, thinner, but still steady in his movements filled him with quiet respect. They spent the first evening sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Eventually, Michael spoke. "You could sell the boat, Dad. Move inland. Stay with me for a while." Edward smiled faintly. "And what would I do without the sea?" Michael had no answer. The next morning, they walked to the harbor together. The Lorna Jane waited, her hull newly repaired, the scratches long sanded away. Edward ran his hand along the rail, feeling the wood's smoothness beneath his fingers. "One more trip," he said. Michael hesitated, but followed him aboard. The tide was rising, and the wind was gentle, carrying the smell of salt and pine. As they pushed away from the dock, the familiar creak of the boat filled the air, and Edward felt something inside him ease for the first time in a long while. They sailed past the cliffs, the water shimmering in the light. From a distance, the beach looked peaceful again. The place where the hatch had been now indistinguishable from the rest of the shoreline. Out on the open water, Edward cut the engine and let the boat drift. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, a band of silver between sea and sky. Michael sat beside him, silent, watching the gulls dip and rise. "You know," Edward said, his voice low, "your mother used to say, the sea never forgets. It just waits." He paused, his eyes on the waves. Maybe she was right. Maybe it waited for me to see what I needed to see. The younger man didn't reply. There was nothing to add. They stayed like that for a long while, the boat rocking gently, the sun climbing higher. When they finally turned back toward shore, Edward felt lighter, as though some unseen weight had begun to lift. The past couldn't be erased, but it could fade, softened by time and tide. As they approached the cove, he saw that the fence around the old hatch site had been partially buried by shifting sand. Nature was reclaiming what humans had disturbed, smoothing over the scars. He took it as a sign. That evening, when the sea turned gold beneath the sunset, he walked down to the water's edge alone. In his hands, he carried a small wooden cross he had carved himself. He planted it near the spot where the hatch once lay and stood there, letting the surf wash over his boots. He didn't say a prayer. He was never much for words, but he thought of all that had been lost and all that had been saved. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the wind. The light shifted, softening into the calm hues of dusk. For the first time since that morning, months ago, the beach felt still, as if it had finally exhaled. Edward turned back toward his house, the faint smile of peace on his weathered face. Tomorrow he would fish again, not for the catch, but for the silence, for the rhythm that had always bound him to the sea. Behind him, the waves rolled in and out, erasing his footprints until only the cross remained, half buried in the sand, a quiet mark of memory against the endless shore. What do you think really happened? Share your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to stay with us for more true mysteries.